She thought the frozen silence of Stillwater Lake would be the place where she finally disappeared. Instead, it became the place where she was finally found, by herself. At 74 years old, discarded by the man she'd given 46 years to, pushed out of the home she'd built with her own two hands, Ingrid was left with nothing but a forgotten lakeside cabin her mother had left her decades ago. A cabin her ex-husband laughed about. A cabin everyone said was too far, too small, too broken to matter. What Reginald didn't know, what Ingrid herself was about to discover, was that when you take everything from a woman who has already survived more than you'll ever understand, you don't break her. You just hand her back to herself. 1 year later, when the world finally came looking for that forgotten cabin in the northern pines, they didn't find a frail old woman waiting to die. They found a secret her mother had hidden there for 50 years. A secret so powerful it would make everyone who ever dismissed her see exactly who they had underestimated. This is Ingrid's story. Proof that 74 is not the end. Proof that being forgotten is not the same as being worthless. And proof that sometimes the women who came before us leave us the exact map we need. We just have to be brave enough to finally open it. If you've ever been told you've lived past the point of matching, if you've ever been handed the scraps of a life and told to be grateful, if you've ever wondered whether the woman you used to be is still somewhere inside you, subscribe now, because stories like Ingrid's remind us that the most powerful chapter of a woman's life can begin at any age. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ingrid turned off the gravel road onto the narrow dirt path that led to Aspenglow and immediately wished she hadn't. The path was barely a path anymore. Weeds had grown waist-high down the center. Fallen branches from the last storm lay across it like broken ribs. Her old station wagon, the one Reginald had said she could keep because he didn't want it, scraped against the undergrowth as she inched forward. And for a long, terrible moment, she thought the engine would give out and leave her stranded 5 miles from the nearest human being. It didn't. It kept going, which somehow felt worse. She was 74 years old. Her hair had gone silver over the past decade, and she hadn't bothered to color it since Reginald made that comment at his firm's Christmas party about how old she was starting to look next to the younger wives. She had knuckles that swelled when the weather turned. She had a bad left hip that made her limp by the end of the day. She had a college degree in literature that she'd never used because Reginald, 46 years ago, had told her he wanted a wife who made a home, not one who chased careers. She had spent 4.5 decades being exactly what he wanted: a gracious hostess, a soft voice, a beautiful home, a dinner on the table, a silent audience to his ambitions. And in exchange, she had been told 2 months ago that he had fallen in love with a 38-year-old paralegal named Mirabel, and that Ingrid would need to be out of the house by the end of October. Out of her house. The house she had chosen the paint colors for. The house she had planted every tree in the yard of. The house where her 2 children, Lucas and Annika, had grown up before they moved away and slowly stopped calling. When she had called Lucas to tell him, he had sighed and said, "Mom, try not to make this harder than it needs to be. Dad says he's being generous." When she had called Annika, her daughter had said, "I'm not picking a side. You'll land on your feet. You always do." They were wrong about that. She had never landed on her feet. She had simply stood where she was placed. The cabin appeared through the pines suddenly, the way cabins do in the northern woods. There was no clearing announcing it, no sign, no welcome. One moment there were only trees, and the next there was Aspenglow. Ingrid killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was enormous. It pressed against the windows of the car. It pressed against her chest. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at what her mother had left her 31 years ago, on the day Esther Lindqvist had died of stroke in a hospital bed in Duluth, with Ingrid holding her hand. The cabin was smaller than she remembered. Much smaller. It was a single-story log structure, maybe 400 square feet, with a sagging porch and a rusted metal roof stained with pine sap and decades of fallen needles. One of the front windows was cracked. The chimney stones had come loose on one side. Moss had crept up the north wall until the wall and the forest floor were almost the same thing. Behind the cabin, through a gap in the pines, she could see Stillwater Lake, gray and still and wide under the cold November sky, with the first thin skin of ice already forming along the shallows. This was where 46 years of marriage had brought her. Her mother had tried to tell her once, back when Ingrid was in her 40s and already exhausted. Aspenglow will be here, min flicka, if you ever need somewhere to go. Ingrid had laughed gently and kissed her mother's forehead and said she didn't need anywhere to go. She had a beautiful home. She hadn't understood then. She understood now. Ingrid opened the car door. The cold hit her like a slap. A dry, mineral cold that smelled of pine resin and lake water and something older than both. She limped toward the cabin, her hip already protesting, and climbed the 3 sagging porch steps. The key her mother had given her 3 decades ago, a brass key she had kept in a small velvet pouch at the back of her jewelry drawer, a secret even from Reginald, fit the lock perfectly. The door swung open with a low groan. Inside, it was worse than she'd prepared for. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood smoke and the unmistakable scent of mice. A single room, a cast-iron stove in the corner, rusted at the seams. A narrow bed frame with a mattress so old it had collapsed in on itself. A small table. 2 wooden chairs, one of them broken. A cupboard with its door hanging off one hinge. A sink with a hand pump that clearly hadn't moved in years. No electricity. No running water. No heat. Nothing. Ingrid stood in the doorway, and something inside her gave way. She was 74 years old. She had $612 in a checking account Reginald hadn't managed to touch. She had 2 suitcases in the back of her car, a box of her mother's old books, and a coat that wasn't warm enough for what was coming. She had nowhere else on earth to go. She sat down slowly on the broken chair, the one that still mostly worked, and she began to cry. Not gently, not the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who was managing. She cried the way a woman cries when she has finally, truly run out of road. She cried until her chest ached and her throat burned, and the sound filled the small cabin and leaked out into the silent pines. Outside on the lake, a single loon called once across the water, a long, low, mournful note that sounded exactly like what she felt inside. Then it was quiet again, and Ingrid sat alone in her mother's cabin as the November light began to fail, wondering if this was where she had come to die. Ingrid woke the next morning with her coat still buttoned to her throat and her breath fogging the cold air above her face. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of old wood smoke and mice reached her, and she remembered. She was alive. Somehow. That was the first surprise. She sat up slowly on the collapsed mattress she had dragged to the floor the night before, and every joint in her body screamed at her. Her left hip felt like someone had driven a nail through it. Her hands were so stiff she couldn't make a fist. Her back had locked up sometime during the night, and when she tried to stand, she had to grab the edge of the small table and pull herself up like a woman twice her age. She was 74. Her body had made one thing very clear overnight. It had not agreed to any of this. She limped to the door and pushed it open, and the northern morning hit her full in the face. The light was different here, thin and silver and clean, the way light only is above the 45th parallel in late autumn. The pines stood perfectly still. The lake was a sheet of slate beyond the trees, and the thin skin of ice along the shallows had grown overnight. Ingrid stepped out onto the sagging porch and stood there in her coat, and she looked at Aspenglow in daylight for the first time since she had last seen it as a child of 7. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin was worse in daylight, but the land was something else. Behind the cabin, a path led down through the pines to a small wooden dock that had mostly survived the decades. To the right, a cleared patch that had once been her mother's garden was now overrun with wild grass and bracken fern. And everywhere were the birches Esther had loved, tall, pale, their last yellow leaves still clinging in places, their white bark glowing softly in the cold morning light. Aspenglow, her mother had called it. Ingrid had forgotten why. She remembered now. The way the light caught the birches at dawn and at dusk, turning them gold. That was Aspenglow. Her mother had named this place for a feeling, for a specific quality of light, for the brief moments when something ordinary caught fire. Ingrid put her swollen hand against the porch railing and felt something tighten in her chest. Not hope. Not yet. Just the smallest crack in the wall of despair she had built overnight. She had work to do. The first week, she survived. That was all. She didn't plan. She didn't dream. She just moved from one small task to the next and prayed her body would hold. She dragged the ruined mattress outside. She swept out the cabin with a birch broom she found behind the stove. She scrubbed mouse droppings off the cupboard shelves with rags torn from an old flannel shirt she'd found folded on a high shelf, a shirt that still, faintly, smelled of her mother's lavender soap. Ingrid pressed it to her face and stood in the middle of the cabin and cried for the second time since arriving, but quieter this time. She pumped the kitchen sink until her arms shook, and on the fourth day, the handle finally loosened and cold, clean water came gasping up from the well below the cabin. She almost fell to her knees. She filled a pot and boiled it on the rusted stove, which she had coaxed back to life with dry birch bark and matches and a stubbornness she didn't know she still owned. She ate carefully. She had brought crackers, canned soup, oatmeal, and a jar of peanut butter. She had figured out on day 2 that she would need to make it last at least a month before she risked the 30-minute drive into Fernbrook Hollow. She spoke to no one. No one called. Her phone had 1 bar of signal if she stood at the end of the dock, but she kept it off to save battery. Lucas did not call. Annika did not call. Reginald certainly did not call. She existed in silence, alone with pine and water and sky. And slowly, something she hadn't expected began to happen. She began to notice things. She noticed that the loons on Stillwater Lake called to each other every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, and that their voices filled the cabin even through closed windows. She noticed that the chickadees who came to the porch railing weren't afraid of her. She noticed that when she sat still on the dock in the late afternoon, the lake turned colors she had no name for. Pewter, then rose, then a soft violet, then black. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the 10th day, Ingrid was sweeping under the narrow bed frame when her broom struck something solid beneath the floorboards. She paused. She got down on her aching knees, a 5-minute operation involving the bed frame and a great deal of breath held against the pain, and she ran her hand along the wooden planks. One of them was loose. Ingrid pressed on it, and it shifted beneath her palm. She worked her fingertips into the seam, and slowly, carefully, she lifted the plank away. Beneath it was a small, flat wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Her mother's handwriting on the top, in faded pencil, said only, "For Ingrid, when you are ready." Ingrid did not open the box that day. She sat on the floor beside the lifted plank for a long time, her hands trembling in her lap, and she looked at her mother's handwriting, that careful, slanted script she had not seen in 31 years, and she felt something she had not felt since the day Reginald told her about Mirabel. Not grief, not fear. She felt seen. For Ingrid, when you are ready. Her mother had written those words at some point before she died. Her mother had known. Her mother had placed this box beneath this floorboard knowing that one day Ingrid would come. Knowing that one day Ingrid would need to come. Ingrid did not feel ready. Not yet. Whatever was inside that box had waited 31 years. It could wait a little longer. She wrapped the oilcloth back over the top, lowered the plank carefully into place, and sat there on the cold floor with her hand pressed flat to the wood for a long, long time. That night, the first rail storm came. It arrived the way northern Minnesota storms do, without apology. The wind began after dark, a low moaning through the pines that built and built until the whole cabin was shaking. Then came the snow, driven sideways in sheets, so thick Ingrid could not see the lake from her window. The temperature dropped so fast she could hear the cabin's old logs creaking as they contracted. She fed the stove every hour. She wore her coat and her hat and 2 pairs of socks and wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, and still she shivered. The wind found every gap in the old chinking between the logs. It came through the cracked window. It came up through the floor. At some point in the night, a branch came down on the roof with a crack like a rifle shot, and Ingrid sat bolt upright on the mattress and waited to see if the ceiling would follow. It didn't, but the wind kept screaming. The storm lasted 2 days. By the second night, Ingrid had burned through nearly all the dry which she had stacked inside, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. She was exhausted. She was hungry in a way she had never been hungry in her life. Her hip had locked so badly she could barely stand. And somewhere around midnight, as the wind howled and the cabin shook and she lay curled on the mattress with ice forming on the inside of the window, something inside her snapped. She sat up. She threw off the blankets. And she stood up in the middle of that freezing cabin, and she screamed. Not words, just sound. A raw, cracked, animal sound that came up from somewhere below her ribs. 46 years of silence finally breaking open. She screamed at the storm. She screamed at Reginald. She screamed at Lucas and Annika, and every dinner party she had smiled through, and every birthday she had remembered for a man who could not be bothered to remember hers. She screamed at the girl she had been at 22, who had said yes when she should have said wait. She screamed until her throat was raw and her legs gave out, and she sank down onto the mattress again, shaking. And then, in the silence that followed, she heard something. A small, rhythmic sound, coming from above her. A tapping. Ingrid went very still. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, and it was coming from the ceiling. Somewhere near the back of the cabin, above the cupboard, there was a sound like a loose board knocking against a beam in the draft. She had never heard it before because she had never screamed before. The storm had been masking it. Her own grief had been masking it. But now, in the stillness after her own voice, she heard it clearly. Ingrid limped across the cabin to the cupboard. She looked up. The ceiling of the cabin was low, just timber beams and rough planks, the underside of what she had assumed was the roof. But now she looked more carefully, and she saw what she had missed for 2 weeks. The planks above the cupboard did not quite match the rest of the ceiling. They were slightly newer, slightly smoother, and in one corner, a small iron ring, rusted almost to invisibility, was set flush into the wood. It wasn't a roof. It was a hatch. Ingrid's heart began to pound. She dragged one of the wooden chairs over. She climbed up with both hands gripping the cupboard, her hips shrieking, and she reached up and hooked her fingers through the iron ring. She pulled. Nothing. It was stuck, decades of damp and dust, and disuse holding it shut. She pulled again, harder, and something in her shoulder gave a warning pop, but she didn't care. She braced her feet on the chair. She hauled down with every ounce of weight her 74-year-old body had left, and the hatch came loose with a cracking sound and swung down on a groaning hinge. A folded wooden ladder dropped out of the ceiling with it. Cold, still air rushed down, air that had been sealed above her for a long, long time. And with it came a smell she had not smelled in 31 years. Linseed oil, cedar shavings, turpentine, the unmistakable, unforgettable smell of her mother's hands. Ingrid stood on the chair in the shaking cabin with the storm still screaming outside, and she looked up into the darkness of the loft her mother had built and hidden and left for her, and she understood, with a clarity that went through her like lightning, that everything she thought she knew about her own mother had been only half the story. She gripped the ladder. She began to climb. The ladder creaked beneath her weight, but it held. Ingrid climbed slowly, one painful rung at a time, and when her head rose above the level of the hatch, she stopped and simply stared. The loft was not large, maybe 8 feet by 12. The ceiling sloped down sharply on both sides, following the pitch of the roof, and a single small window at the gable end, a window Ingrid had never noticed from outside because it was half hidden by pine branches, let in the pale stormlight. But what was inside that small space stopped her breath. An easel stood in the center of the loft, an unfinished painting still clamped to it, a painting of Stillwater Lake at dawn, the birches catching fire in the first light, the loons just visible on the water. Beside the easel, a workbench ran the length of the wall, and on it lay her mother's tools. Carving knives of every size, arranged neatly on a strip of leather. Chisels, gouges, a small mallet. A wooden plane worn smooth by decades of use. And on shelves that climbed the slanted walls, dozens of carvings. Birds. Loons, of course, but also owls, chickadees, a great blue heron with its neck curved like a question mark. Small wooden boxes inlaid with different colored woods. A carved panel of a woman's face that Ingrid recognized, after a long moment, as her own grandmother. Paintings leaned against the wall in stacks. Landscapes, lake scenes, a portrait of a young girl with two brown braids who Ingrid realized, with a small sharp gasp, was herself at 7. Ingrid pulled herself fully into the loft and sat down heavily on the wooden floor. Her mother had been an artist. Her mother had been an artist her entire life, and Ingrid had never known. She sat there in the cold loft as the storm raged on below, and she tried to make sense of it. Esther Lindqvist, who had spent her life cooking her husband's meals and pressing his shirts and listening to him complain about his back. Esther, who had never once, in Ingrid's memory, picked up a paintbrush or a carving knife in their family home in Duluth. Esther, who had been married for 51 years to a man named Carl Lindqvist, Ingrid's father, who had laughed at his wife when she spoke and cut her off mid-sentence at dinner parties, and who had, Ingrid remembered now with a cold, clear shock, once thrown a small wooden bird across the kitchen and broken it because he said it was a waste of a grown woman's time. Her mother had not picked up a carving knife again in their home. Not ever. Not that Ingrid had seen. But she had come here. Somehow, across the decades, her mother had come here, to this cabin, to this loft, and she had kept her art alive in secret. She had carried it up that hidden ladder and closed the hatch behind her and become, for whatever hours she could steal, the artist she actually was. Ingrid turned her head slowly, and that was when she saw the envelope. It sat propped on the workbench, against a small carved wooden loom, in a spot that would catch the light of anyone who climbed up into the loft. The paper had yellowed. Her mother's handwriting on the front said, simply, "For my Ingrid." She took a long time to reach for it. Her hands were shaking when she finally did. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in her mother's careful Swedish-accented English. "Min älskade flicka, if you're reading this, then you have finally come. I have hoped and feared this day in equal measure for many years. I know what you are living, Ingrid. I know because I lived it too. I married your father at 20. By 30, I had forgotten who I was. By 40, I had accepted it. By 50, I had decided it was too late. This cabin saved me. My mother's mother left it to my mother, and my mother left it to me, and now I'm leaving it to you. It is a woman's cabin. It has always been. The men in our family never wanted it, because it is small and far and seems worthless to them. That is how it has survived. Come here, min flicka. Open the hatch. Use the tools. You will not believe what your hands remember. You were always the one with the eyes of an artist, even as a small girl. I watched your father beat that out of you before you were 12, the way mine beat it out of me. I was not strong enough to stop him then. Forgive me, but it is not gone. It is only buried, and you will find it again exactly where I left mine for you, here in Aspenglow, where the birches catch fire at dawn. You're not too old. You are not finished. You are only now beginning. Mama." Ingrid sat in the cold loft and read the letter 3 times before she could make the words stop swimming. Then she folded it with slow, careful hands, and she held it against her chest, and she wept. But these were not the tears of 2 weeks ago. These were not the tears of a woman who had run out of road. These were the tears of a woman who had just discovered that the road went much further than she'd thought, and that her mother had walked ahead of her on it all along, leaving markers, lighting the way. When Ingrid finally climbed down the ladder hours later, the storm had stopped. The cabin was silent. The stove had gone out. She did not relight it. Not yet. Instead, she went to the workbench she had cleared on day 3, and she laid the letter down where she could see it. And then she got to work. December came down on Aspenglow like a hammer. The cold was not the cold Ingrid had known in Duluth all her life. This was something else, a deep, patient, northern cold that crept in through the log walls no matter how much she fed the stove, that froze the water in her kettle if she left it too far from the heat, that made her fingers ache so badly at night she couldn't sleep. She had built a small routine in the weeks after finding the loft. Wait before dawn. Light the stove. break the ice on the water bucket, eat half a cup of oatmeal because she was rationing, climb the ladder to the loft, slowly, always slowly, her hips screaming, and sit at her mother's workbench with a small piece of birch wood and one of the carving knives. She had not made anything yet. Not really. She had spent the first week just holding the tools, turning them in her swollen hands, feeling the smoothed wood of the handles where her mother had held them. She had studied the unfinished painting on the easel. She had read the letter so many times the folds were beginning to soften, and she had tried to carve. It was humiliating. Her first attempt, a simple bird, following the shape of one of her mother's smaller loons, came out lopsided and rough, the lines all wrong, the wood splitting where she had cut across the grain instead of with it. Her hands didn't know what they were doing. Her mother had said her hands would remember, but her hands did not remember. Her hands had spent 46 years arranging flowers and folding napkins and holding the arm of a man at charity galas. Her hands were strangers to this. She had sat at the workbench on the third day and thrown the ruined bird across the loft and wept. But she had climbed back up the next morning, and the morning after that, because what else was there? By mid-December, her food was running low. She made the drive into Fernbrook Hollow, a terrifying 30 minutes on unplowed roads in a car that had no business on them. And she spent $94 on rice and beans and canned vegetables and a bag of apples and 4 candles, because her kerosene was almost gone. She did not speak to the cashier beyond what was required. She did not meet anyone's eyes. She felt, walking through that small grocery store, as though she were made of glass, and anyone who looked at her too closely would see straight through to what she was. She drove home and unloaded the groceries and climbed the ladder and worked until the light failed. Then, on the morning of December 22nd, she fell. She was coming down the ladder with one of her mother's smaller carving knives in her hand, a mistake, a stupid violation of a rule she had set for herself on day one, and her hip gave out halfway down. Her foot slipped. She came down hard on the cabin floor, her right shoulder hitting first, and the knife in her hand caught her across the inside of her left forearm on the way down. The cut was deep. Ingrid lay on the floor of the cabin in the gray December light and watched her own blood spread across the wooden planks and felt, for a moment, completely calm. Then the pain arrived, and she began to shake. She managed to crawl to the sink. She pumped water with her good hand. She wrapped the wound with strips of the old flannel shirt that still, somehow, smelled of her mother. She tied it as tight as she could with her teeth and one trembling hand. The bleeding slowed, but did not stop. She could not drive. Not like this. Not on those roads. Not in this cold. Not with this arm. She lay down on the mattress and pulled the blankets over herself and stared at the ceiling of the cabin. Her shoulder throbbed. Her arm throbbed. Her hip throbbed. Everything she had was throbbing. And something inside her, the thing that had been holding her up since the letter, since the loft, since the hatch, simply let go. She was 74 years old. She was bleeding on the floor of a cabin in the woods. She had no one. Reginald would not come. Lucas would not come. Annika would not come. She could die here, right now, on this mattress, and nobody would know for weeks. Months, maybe. Her body would freeze, and the mice would come, and her mother's tools would sit and use in the loft for another 31 years, until some stranger bought the land and found her bones. I can't do this, she thought. I can't. I'm too old. I was always too old. Mama was wrong. She turned her face to the wall, and she waited to die. She lay there for hours. The light shifted across the cabin floor. The stove went out. The cold began to seep back in. And somewhere deep in the afternoon, half delirious, Ingrid turned her head and looked up at the open hatch above the cupboard. She had stopped closing it weeks ago, and she saw, hanging from a peg just inside the loft, the first bird she had ever carved. The lopsided one. The one she had thrown. She had climbed back up a week later and hung it there anyway. She didn't remember doing it. But there it was. Crooked. Wrong. Small. And also, the only thing she had ever made with her own hands, for herself, for no one else, in 74 years of living. Ingrid looked at that terrible little bird, and she understood something she had been circling for weeks without touching. Her worth was not in being seen. Her worth was in the making. She sat up. Slowly. She relit the stove. She was not finished yet. Ingrid healed slowly. The cut on her arm left a long, pale scar that ran from the inside of her elbow halfway down to her wrist. She could not use that hand for 2 weeks. She ate one-handed, pumped water one-handed, fed the stove one-handed, and she did not climb the ladder until January, when she could finally grip a rung without the wound reopening. But when she did climb again, she climbed differently. Something had shifted in her after the fall. She worked now not because she was trying to prove anything to her mother's ghost, or to Reginald, or to herself. She worked because working itself had become the point. Her hands were slow. Her hands were clumsy. Her hands were 74 years old. None of that mattered. What mattered was that each morning she climbed the ladder and she sat at her mother's workbench, and she made one small mark on one small piece of wood. And slowly, impossibly, her hands began to remember. By the end of January, she had finished her first real carving. A chickadee, small enough to fit in her palm, with the head tilted the way chickadees tilt their heads when they land on the porch railing. It was not perfect, but it was right. She held it up to the light, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Pride. By February, she had finished 3 more birds and repaired the broken chair in the cabin using her mother's tools and a piece of birch she had dragged up from the lake. By the end of February, she had begun her first painting on a small wooden panel. Not the lake, not yet. She wasn't ready for the lake, but the view of the birches from the cabin window at dawn. The first time she mixed her mother's old oil paints on the palette and touched the brush to the panel. Her hand shook so badly she had to set the brush down and wait. Then she picked it up again, and she painted. March came. The days stretched longer. The cold loosened its grip by small, reluctant increments. Ingrid found herself standing on the porch in the late afternoon, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the light move across the lake, and realizing she had gone an entire afternoon without thinking about Reginald. Not once. Not even as a shadow at the edge of her mind. She was too busy watching the light. In early April, the ice broke on Stillwater Lake. It happened overnight. Ingrid woke to a sound she did not recognize, a low, cracking, groaning music coming from the water, and she hurried out onto the porch in her coat and stood there in the cold blue dawn and watched the lake come back to life. Great slabs of ice shifted and broke and slid against each other, making a sound like distant thunder. The loons returned the next morning. She heard their call across the water as the sun rose, and she wept standing barefoot on the dock because it sounded like being welcomed home. The garden came next. Ingrid had found her mother's old seed tins in the loft, and though most of the seeds were too old to germinate, a few peas, radishes, a small paper packet labeled Esther's tomatoes in her mother's handwriting were still alive. She cleared the overgrown patch behind the cabin by hand, her hip complaining the entire time, and she planted what she had. Most of it came up. Some of it didn't. She did not mind. She was learning that the work was the thing, not the result. By May, the cabin was unrecognizable. She had spent the winter mending it from the inside, and now that the weather allowed, she worked on the outside. She re-chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of clay from the lakeshore and dried pine needles. She patched the roof with scraps of metal she found in the old woodshed. She fixed the cracked window with a pane she carried home from the hardware store in Fernbrook Hollow, wrapped in a blanket on the passenger seat of her station wagon. She painted the door, a soft, clear green, the color of birch leaves in early summer, and she began carrying carvings with her into town. The first time she walked into the small handcraft market in Fernbrook Hollow with 3 of her birds in a paper bag, her heart was beating so hard she thought she might faint. The woman who ran the market, a kind-faced woman in her 60s named Greta, took one look at the chickadee Ingrid laid on the counter and went very still. "Who carved this?" Greta asked. "I did," Ingrid said. Her voice barely came out. Greta looked up at her, and then she smiled, a slow, astonished smile, and she said, "Where have you been hiding?" Ingrid did not know how to answer, so she said the only true thing: in someone else's life. Greta bought all 3 birds that afternoon. She asked for more. By the end of May, Ingrid was leaving 6 or 7 pieces at the market each week, and Greta was selling every single one. The money was not much, but it was hers. Every dollar she earned was a dollar that had come from her own hands, her own eyes, her own patient slow becoming. She bought paintbrushes with it. She bought good food. She bought a warm wool sweater in a deep forest green. She bought a small hand mirror, and she hung it on the cabin wall. And for the first time in decades, when she looked at her own face, she did not flinch. She saw a woman with a scar on her arm and strong hands and steady eyes. She saw an artist. She saw her mother's daughter. She saw, finally, herself. He came on a Saturday afternoon in late June. Ingrid was kneeling in the garden behind the cabin, thinning the radishes when she heard the sound. At first, she didn't recognize it. 8 months of silence had changed her ears. Then it came again, the low growl of an engine, laboring up the dirt path that led to Aspenglow, and she sat back on her heels in the soil and went very still. No one came up that path. No one. Greta did not come. The women from Fernbrook Hollow did not come. The postal carrier left her mail at a rented box in town. The sound of an engine here meant one thing. Someone had come looking for her. Ingrid stood slowly, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked around the side of the cabin just as the car emerged through the pines. A black Lincoln, spotless, impossibly out of place on that rough road. And behind the wheel, with his jaw set the way he always set it when he was preparing to be reasonable with someone he considered unreasonable, Reginald. He parked beside her station wagon. He got out. He stood there in the dappled light with his hand resting on the open car door, and he stared at her. Ingrid knew what he was seeing. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming. He was seeing a woman in a faded canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, revealing the long pale scar on her left forearm. He was seeing hands stained with dirt and green with garden juice. He was seeing silver hair pulled back with a piece of twine because she had misplaced her last elastic 2 days ago. He was seeing sun on her face and calluses on her palms, and a body that had grown lean and capable in ways he had never seen it before. He was seeing the woman she had never been allowed to become while she was married to him, and he did not know what to do with her. Ingrid, he finally said. His voice was careful. My God, look at you. She said nothing. She waited. He walked toward her slowly, the way a man walks toward an animal he is not sure is tame, and he stopped about 10 feet away. He looked past her at the cabin, at the green door, at the garden, at the carved wooden sign she had hung above the porch 3 weeks ago. Aspenglow, in letters she had burned into the wood with a piece of heated wire, the way her mother had taught her, even though her mother had not been alive to teach her anything. You did this, he said. It was not a question. It was almost an accusation. I did, Ingrid said. Alone. Alone. Reginald let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He ran his hand through his hair. He looked older than she remembered, grayer, heavier, and somehow smaller than the man she had stood beside for 46 years. He was wearing a pale linen jacket and leather shoes that were already ruined from the dirt path. Ingrid, he stopped. He started again. I have been looking for you for 2 weeks. Your phone is off. The bank said you had a post office box in some town called Fernbrook. I drove up here on a hunch. I didn't even know this place existed until I went through your mother's old papers. My mother left it to me 31 years ago, Ingrid said. You never asked. He flinched, but he kept going. Ingrid, listen to me. I made a mistake. I want you to know that. Mirabel, it wasn't what I thought. We're not together anymore. And I've been thinking a great deal about us, about everything we built, and Reginald. Her voice was quiet. It stopped him. She walked over to the porch steps. She sat down. She looked at him, and she saw him, really saw him, maybe for the first time in her adult life. A tired man in expensive shoes, standing at the edge of life he had never been invited into, trying to pull her back to a life she had already buried. Do you know what you gave me? She said. When you put me out? He did not answer. You gave me back my hands, she said. You gave me back my mornings. You gave me back my mother. You gave me back the girl I was at 19, before I learned to make myself small enough to fit beside you. You gave me everything you spent 46 years quietly taking, Reginald. And you didn't even know you were doing it. That's what makes it unforgivable. Not the betrayal, the blindness. Ingrid, I'm not finished. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. You came here expecting to find me broken. You came here expecting to be generous. You came here hoping I would be grateful. And I want you to hear me very clearly, because I will not say it twice." She stood up from the porch step. "I'm not coming back. Not today. Not next week. Not ever. You are not welcome at this cabin. You will not call the number I am going to give my lawyer. You will not contact our children and ask them to plead your case. You will leave here, and you will drive back to whatever life you have made without me. And you will let me have the one thing you never let me have in 46 years." She met his eyes. "My own life." Reginald stood there. He opened his mouth. He closed it. And then, without another word, he turned, got back into his car, and drove away down the dirt path, the black Lincoln swallowed by the pines. Ingrid sat back down on the porch step. She let out a long, slow breath. Somewhere behind her, across the lake, a loon called. She smiled. Thea came first. It was a week after Reginald's visit. A soft July morning, the kind when the lake is a flat mirror and the loons are calling in long, unhurried notes. Ingrid was on the dock cleaning paintbrushes and a coffee can of turpentine when she heard a car pull up at the cabin. She tensed, expecting Reginald again. But the voice that called out was a woman's, uncertain, apologetic. "Hello, is anyone home?" Ingrid walked up the path and found a woman about her own age standing beside a dusty hatchback, holding one of Ingrid's carved chickadees in her hand. She was thin. Her gray hair was cut short. Her eyes were red-rimmed in a way Ingrid recognized immediately. "My name is Thea," the woman said. "I bought this at the market in Fernbrook Hollow 3 weeks ago. Greta told me where to find you. I'm sorry for coming. I didn't know where else to go." Ingrid looked at the woman, at the chickadee in her hand, at the tremble in her jaw that she was trying to hide. "Come inside," Ingrid said. "I'll make tea." Thea was 72. Her husband had died the previous spring, and her son and daughter-in-law had decided, without consulting her, that she needed to move into an assisted living facility in St. Paul. The paperwork was already being drawn up. Thea had bought the chickadee on a whim during a last solo drive through the north, and something in the small carved bird, the tilt of its head, the patience of its making, had told her the woman who made it might understand. Ingrid poured her tea, and then she said the only true thing she had learned. "You start small. One thing. One morning. You take whatever you have left, even if it feels like nothing, and you make one small thing with it. Not for them. For you." Thea stayed 3 hours. She came back the next week, and the week after that. Then came Wanda, 65, recently divorced after 38 years, whose children had told her to be an adult about it. Then Odetta, 78, a widow whose late husband had left her the house and whose stepchildren were trying to take it back. Then Callista, 59, who had just been pushed out of the job she had held for 24 years and told by the HR director that she should consider retirement. Then Greta herself, kind-faced Greta from the market, who drove out one September afternoon and cried at Ingrid's kitchen table about a husband who had been unkind to her for 40 years and who she was, finally, at 70, thinking about leaving. Ingrid did not know how they found her. She did not advertise. She did not invite them. They came the way water finds low ground, quietly, inevitably, one at a time. And Ingrid did what her mother's letter had done for her. She opened the door. She poured the tea. She told them the truth about what she had lived. And then she took them up the ladder to the loft, and she put a piece of birch wood and one of her mother's smaller knives in their hands, and she said, "Try." They tried. By late September, the cabin had become something Ingrid had never planned and never imagined. On Saturday afternoons, 5 or 6 women gathered in the loft, carving and painting and talking. Some weeks they worked in silence for hours. Some weeks they laughed so loudly the loons lifted off the water. Odetta had learned to carve small wooden spoons. Callista had discovered she was good, really good at painting. Thea had made a chickadee of her own, and when she held it up, it was not lopsided. It was right. October came. 1 year since Ingrid had turned onto that narrow dirt path in her broken-down station wagon with $612 and 2 suitcases and nowhere on earth to go. On the afternoon of the anniversary, Ingrid sat alone on the dock. The birches were on fire along the shore. The Aspenglow her mother had named this place for the light that turned ordinary things gold. She had a notebook on her lap. She was writing. "Today I'm 75, she wrote. "I live alone in my mother's cabin at the edge of Stillwater Lake. I have strong hands. I have a scar on my arm. I have a loft full of carvings and paintings, and I have a community of women who found me without being called. And I have, for the first time in my life, a self that I recognize when I look in a mirror. I was not too old. Mama was right. I was only now beginning. If someone is reading this someday, a granddaughter, a stranger, a woman who comes to Aspenglow because someone told her where to find it, I want her to know this. You were never worthless. You were only hidden. You were a cabin in the woods that no one wanted because they could not see what was inside. You were a woman with an artist's hands who was told to fold napkins. You were loved, always, by the women who came before you, even the ones you never knew were watching. Open the hatch. Climb the ladder. You are not finished. You are only now beginning." She closed the notebook. She looked out across the water. Somewhere a loon called. Ingrid smiled, and the lake, and the birches, and the light, and the quiet kept going. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.